So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our meeting. I'm very pleased to be able to announce our rector, Professor Bernhard Eitel, to start our meeting here with a welcome address. And before that, I think Alistair is taking a picture of the room even. So if you are in the room and would like to be in the picture, then please look at Alistair, and if not, then don't. 3, 2, 1. I take one myself.
I would like this is a picture for Catherine Lamont, who's very sorry that she's not here today, because she's at a meeting of the board of directors of EBRAINS. It's one of their first meetings, and we would like you to wave if that's possible.
So, Professor Eitel, thank you for being here, and
thank you very much. So, dear colleagues, Frau Ritter-Valle, welcome in Heidelberg, welcome here on the campus. As rector of Heidelberg University, it's my privilege and honor to welcome you in Heidelberg, as far as you are not from Heidelberg itself. So the Human Brain Project, and this is a part of the overall project here on the campus and beyond, is one of our prominent endeavors, not only in physics, but also in physics. In Heidelberg, the focus is to study the physical basis of neuromorphic systems, whereas at other places, the brain is in the focus of the studies. The project here is well interconnected with several outstanding collaborations, such as the activities of the Quantum Physics Center on the Excellence Cluster Structures, managed by our colleagues Salmhofer, Wienhardt, and Klassen. A couple of years ago, we decided to invest for this project, to invest in an own building for the Neuromorphic Computing, due to its exciting perspectives for several disciplines on the campus, for the advancement of research, and the expected societal impact of the overall project. Don't forget that. Neuroinformatics, learning from human brains, and crossing obvious thresholds for data handling by new technologies, faster, less energy intense, as learning systems like the human brain. What a fascinating approach. And at the end, I'm dreaming to do all this with respect to our Center for Advanced Materials. I have to explain this a little bit. On the basis of new organic electronic materials, biocompostable, light, small, and linked with stroke therapy by physicians. That's my dream. That's not reality. That's not reality in this project, but that's my dream. So a little bit like Martin Luther King, I have a dream. But that remains my private science fiction, not without dangers. See, for examples of ethical aspects, perspectives or hybrid humans, and so on. But just imagine what it can mean if you have organic electronic systems managed on the basis of physics, of human brain knowledge as outcome of your project, and then you can repair parts of the brain blessed or damaged by strokes, and then think about the hybrid humans and all the ethical problems, societal impacts beyond. It's not only the project itself, but also the perspectives. They are exciting, but they are also or it's necessary to fit them in best way also in humanities and in neurosciences. We still grieve for our charismatic colleague Karl-Heinz Meyer, who passed away, but we are fully convinced that the Schemmel Group, together with the Oberthaler Group and newly recruited experts, all activities interconnected with other research projects and large collaborations like structures, they all will make the European Institute for Neuromorphic Computing, as well as parts and larger parts of human brain projects in Heidelberg and beyond, a success. We are convinced that Heidelberg, with its well-developed physics landscape, offers best conditions for the physical part of the Human Brain Project, because different groups will contribute, will benefit, correspond, and fertilize it. It's not isolated on the campus, but well embedded in an interdisciplinary, vibrant research community where research surprises have the chance to emerge earlier and more evident than at other places. But it's also very well interconnected, far beyond with other research institutions and campuses in Europe. It's part of a European initiative, and we all have to be proud of the Europeans to be able to foster such an exciting idea and to provide the means to realize it step by step. On the campus, the European Institute for Neuromorphic Computing, about 500 meters from here, with its special, and let me stress, very expensive infrastructure, and by its subsurface tunnel system, which connects it with the other buildings on the campus and infrastructure, will become also a vibrant research node for the scientists in Heidelberg, as well as for collaborating physicists from other places. Next year, we will accomplish the building and will provide trend-setting infrastructures. With respect to these developments, you're meeting EBRAINS, new enabling infrastructure for neuroscience, is in Heidelberg at the right place, together with neurobiology and our physicians. It's in Heidelberg at the right place and is organized at the right time. I'm grateful for the efforts of the organizers, the helping hands behind the official curtains, and you all coming to Heidelberg. I wish you greatest success, inspiring exchange, and deep impact in a positive way, in a positive sense, and deep impact also in non-physics communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Eitel. So my name is Roman Volchenkov. I will be leading the event and announcing the speakers. So the first talk will be Introduction to the Human Brain Project, and this will be done by a video message recorded by Katrin Amons, who is a scientific research director of the project. She sends her apologies for not being present here due to circumstances.
Magnificence, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, welcome to the Human Brain Project public event, EBRAINS. This event takes place in order to introduce a new infrastructure for brain research here in Heidelberg. Why an infrastructure? The human brain is one of the most complex systems that we know. And in order to understand the human brain, we do not need only empirical research, but also theory, and we need a strong infrastructure supporting data analytics, modeling, and simulation. And of course, we have to take into consideration from the very beginning that ethics and society play a central role in this endeavor. So where we are in the Human Brain Project, we are now in the so-called SGA2 phase that is a little bit more than 3 years before the project officially is finished. And in this phase, last phase, we would like to build a European infrastructure that is sustainable. So we plan to submit a proposal to the European Commission to go to the so-called S3 roadmap in order to provide the tools and services that we are developing and have developed during the last year on a longer term to the European science community. And in this last phase of the project, we would like to focus on computing the brain to make this possible. That means we are addressing the human multiscale brain connectome and its variability, and would like to better understand what are the networks for cognition and consciousness. And apply this knowledge also to better understand adaptive architecture of networks of cognitive function and to build and provide access to the EBRAINS infrastructure. Today, on the 25th of November, we are launching EBRAINS publicly in Heidelberg in order to reach out to a larger community of users of this EBRAINS infrastructure. What can you expect from this day? Our Infrastructure Operations Director, Jan Bialy, will introduce the concept of EBRAINS as a platform for collaboration in digital neuroscience, and he will provide some examples of how this platform enables, for example, provenance tracking of data and allows to follow up the acquisition of data up to the publication of data in a very transparent and very reproducible way. And this effort is connected to other efforts that we have in Europe, for example, regarding EOSC. Petra Ritter from the Charité in Berlin will introduce the virtual brain. The virtual brain is a tool that allows to develop models of the human brain, not only in health, but also in disease. So the virtual brain includes models of brains of patients with epilepsy, stroke, tumors, and Alzheimer's disease, for example. And it allows to develop individualized models. Why it is so important? Because at the end, we want to create a benefit for individual patients. And the HBP is very proud that this summer, a large clinical trial started in France with about 400 participants undergoing surgery for epilepsy, and the virtual brain will be tested in this very concrete clinical environment. Rüdiger Dillmann will give an introduction to neurobotics and how we can use basic neuroscience knowledge, for example, from how we control movements to neurobotics applications, and will present recent results, for example, on how control pointing motion is implemented with spiking neural networks, a technique that we are developing in neuromorphic computing. Dirk Pleiter from the Research Center Jülich will introduce a federated high-performance computing infrastructure which enables cloud and storage services for researchers in whole Europe. So this is the e-infrastructure which includes workflows running on high-performance computing, and it brings high-performance computing to the exascale range for neuroscientists. ECAI is a funding mechanism that allows access to the interactive computing infrastructure provided by Phoenix. And here's a very concrete example how already now this network works. It comes from a collaboration of Jülich and Zurich scientists running workflows on 2 different sites in 2 different countries. And of course, such workflows can be then transferred to other high-performance computing centers, and our aim is to acquire these centers according to the needs of a certain process that has to be computed in the Human Brain Project. One of the components that we would like to more and more closely integrate into this Phoenix infrastructure are neuromorphic computing. And the HBP is very proud of having 2 most advanced neuromorphic computing systems in the project from the very beginning. These are Spinnaker and BrainSkills here from Heidelberg. Steve Ferber will illustrate what the advances in neuromorphic computing technology are and show, for example, that simulations of a cortical column here done on a Spinnaker base are for certain workflows faster than on classical supercomputing. And we think that learning from the brain, for example, how plasticity and learning are being implemented in natural networks, also helps us to further develop neuromorphic devices. In the last talk of the day, Lars Klüber will give an overview about the societal relations, neuroethics, and community building. We observe that approaches such artificial neuronal networks and AI are dynamically evolving, and they complement existing tools for researching complex systems. This opens, of course, new perspectives in medicine, for example, for therapy, diagnostic, and prediction, but also neuroenhancement and related ethical questions. Insight from brain research, for example, concerning plasticity, continuous learning, architecture of networks inspire new technology in neuromorphic computing, robotics, and other fields. But in order to make this possible, we have to make sure that the algorithms, therefore, are transparent and they are verifiable. And the degree to which it's successful has consequences for issues such as safety, security, responsibility, but also liability. So the evolution of systems processing information has to be accompanied from the very beginning by ethical reflection. And we see that the demands on users and researchers are constantly growing. This creates an educational mission and also requires new strategy for outreach. All these topics will be addressed in this event today, and I wish you a nice and fruitful day here in Heidelberg with many new insights and many new ideas. Thank you very much.
Yes, that was a welcome message from Katrin Amons. And now I have a pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jan Bioli, who is HPP Infrastructure Operations Director. And Jan will present you the EBRAINS, the platform collaboration in a digital neuroscience. Please, Jan.
I need to share the slide.
Thank you very much. It's a special pleasure to be here in Heidelberg on this occasion. The University of Heidelberg has played a very important role in the Human Brain Project since its beginning, not at least through the key contributions of the late Professor Karl-Heinz Meyer.
No problem. Yeah, try again.
Trying again, yes? No?
Okay.
Okay, you try?
Now, can you turn it down?
Let's see if you can hear me well now. Is it okay? That's probably better. Then we're ready. So, brain research is a very popular topic nowadays. And the Human Brain Project is actually the first in a wave of large brain projects. As you will see along this timeline, there have been some brain projects of very large size before 2013, and then comes the wave, with the Human Brain Project being the first, and US Brain, Japan Brain Minds, and other initiatives, as you will see here. Now, the first release of platforms that could be said to represent an infrastructure came March 2016. At that point in time, the Human Brain Project had been functional for 30 months and had developed 6 prototype platforms. These platforms were neuroinformatics, dealing with organizing and managing data and brain atlases and tools for analysis. The brain simulation platform, working with models of the brain, simulating these models. Medical informatics, high-performance analytics and computing, required for virtually all of this. Neuromorphic computing, using brain-inspired computing, and neurobotics. Now let's look at these 6 together. They, of course, need to connect. So data, for example, coming from one platform is stored through services provided by another one. Analytical tools are running on machines elsewhere. Modeling simulation can go all the way to robotics, to have an environment for the models, etc. So these things are connected. And in this context, EBRAINS is our concept for bringing the platforms together. But EBRAINS is a bit more than that. So let's look at the definition. EBRAINS, a research e-infrastructure for brain research, helping the research community collect, analyze, share, integrate, and model data about the brain with the aim of better understanding the functioning of the human brain and its diseases. So at this event, we will introduce the EBRAINS. We could call it the pre-launch. It's not a release of everything, but it's a release of a first set of services. More services, more tools and services will be released regularly over the coming 3 years, many over the next half year. All these services in EBRAINS are targeting external users. This is the place to go if you are outside the Human Brain Project. Of course, in addition, there is a Human Brain Project website. Everybody is welcome there as well. That is a project website. It follows the needs of the project, so to speak, and external users can go there as well. And everything which is being developed will be accessible at one stage or another through the Human Brain Project website. But when it is finished and ready to go out to the community, it is in EBRAINS. So what do we have? We have a basic infrastructure, of course, provided by some of the platforms you just saw on the pictures, where tools and services are running, and a number of data assets. So, for example, data with metadata describing the data are existing in this data assets layer, used in a number of analytical workflows. Features are extracted from these data, used in the context of building models of the brain, performing simulations. At a number of different sites in Europe, in the Human Brain Project, and also now outside the Human Brain Project through the services provided by EBRAINS. So this infrastructure will include what we call fair data services, defined in a moment, brain atlases for data integration, brain modeling simulation, closed-loop artificial intelligence and robotics, medical brain activity data, interactive high-performance computing, and neuromorphic computing. So EBRAINS will support a wide range of research methodologies, facilitate collaborative research, data sharing, integrate a number of ICT services, and provide practical working solutions for those who do experiments, those who do computational modeling, and clinicians. The project and work in progress is at the humanbrainproject.eu website. The ebrains.eu is powered by the HBP with the working solutions for the scientific community presented at ebrains.eu. At this point in time, we have a taster of what is coming soon. You will find data, share data, and brain atlases, which is a small part of what EBRAINS will contain. Let's take a brief look at this. So share data, find data, that is about comprehensive tools and services for organizing and managing data. In the little video there, you could see the traffic to one of the supercomputer centers where these data are stored. They are then discoverable through a search, and they have DOIs that allows the data to be identified and cited correctly. So the key instrument there is the EBRAINS knowledge graph, which is then the place where all the metadata are organized. You can go in there, search according to different methods, find what's available at locations or according to certain specifications, and pick up those data, make use of the data, and cite them, just as if you had found a publication, but this is much, much deeper. It is the real data behind the publications. The EBRAINS brain atlases, the logic is the same as in geography. Who would do geography today without all the fantastic services we have on the web? And of course, this is what we're aiming for in the brain, and we do have it to some extent already. So the EBRAINS brain atlases, that is the way into the future for looking into and organizing brain data. Here's a video produced at Forschungszentrum Jülich, a group of Katrin Amunds, Timo Dickscheid, where we are looking at here the big brain, which is a very, very large, high detail, high resolution, three-dimensional volume of a human brain that you can navigate and look into the details, and that they are working on to divide into different pieces, as if we were looking back in history to geography before the Earth was completely mapped. You had preliminary maps of various kinds, improving all the time up to a level where you have full insight. There are also the tools that allows you to navigate inside these atlases and to pick up information at different locations and identify what there is at a certain area region in the brain to compare with other available results and to create new combinations of data that you otherwise would not be able to dig out by going to classical literature research. So a particular challenge in neuroscience is that we have to deal with data from many levels, all the way from the smallest picometer, nanometer level up to a whole brain, the space dimension, and the time dimension from picoseconds, the molecular level speed, up to the years, processes of aging, for example. Many modalities, many scales. This is very challenging. And if we're going to understand the brain at some level, we need to integrate. We need to deal with data integration, combining data in different sources, providing users with a unified view. More and more important as the volume of data are increasing, of course, not only the focus in our field, it's a general topic today, and with numerous challenges. The FAIR principles are in this regard very helpful, and having the data findable, accessible, let's say interpretable, and reusable are key aspects that we adhere to. So the culture of knowledge sharing is well developed. We publish papers, we convey messages about what we have learned. But knowledge builds on data, and the culture of sharing data is lagging a little bit behind. This is what we're doing in the HPP Neurodata Management, expressed through the Find Data and Share Data services. Creating large repositories of organized and curated data from HPP and other sources. They're also open today for other projects to enter their data in these systems, accompanied by workflows to make it possible to share the data, and teams of curators that can help with this. We have a 3-tier curation process, as you will see in a moment. And the whole logic, of course, is that in this way, the classical way of studying or working in science, from questions via experiments and data to analysis, interpretation, and conclusion, ending in papers, usually focusing on interpretation and conclusions, will shift to a focus on the real data. This is the key aspect, and this is absolutely essential in order for us to have reproducible research and to make better use of the data and see new opportunities. As, of course, again, not only in neuroscience, as European Open Science Cloud is actually dealing with this at a broader level, and we could call ourselves an instance of this and contributes, of course, to the European Open Science Cloud in this regard. So enabling data sharing is key. To extract key features relevant for modeling and simulation, how can you do it if you're only going to read a paper? To improve the analysis, put together new combinations of data, add data, which is attractive for experimentalists and clinicians. To have future data sharing impact factors, which is important for everyone who wants to build a career, they have to start sharing the data. There's no other way. So we are building trust and professionalizing the sharing of data. So here's a brief overview. Experiments, models, simulation, the research data are stored in the HPP data storage, the future EBRAINS data storage, curated in a process that goes through multiple steps. The first step is an initial data upload where some basic metadata are tagged to the data. All these metadata goes into what we call a knowledge graph. We add information about where in the brain this data are from, and we can do a deeper curation and add more specific metadata, increasing the value of the data. The search can be text, or it can be a spatial search to look for locations and see what's available. The search result is then taken to the tools and workflow environment for viewing and analysis in different contexts for prediction, modeling, simulation, neuromorphic computing, robotics. The share data process is going through multiple steps. There is a concrete submission, there is a review process, an acceptance process, curation, integration process. Data goes out through the EBRAINS Find Data, and one can also add more in-depth data at a later stage. It's comparable to publishing a paper. It's a much faster process, and it gives a lot of additional value. The share data has a number of very concrete steps in order to be implemented. These are all working, all teams are in place, And we have a machinery, the first in the world for neuroscience in this regard, that can really deal with the challenge of creating findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable data. Here's the EBRAINS Find Data user interface. You can, for example, see now there are 479 researchers that have contributed data. These data exists in 571 data sets containing in the range of 50,000 to 100,000 files total from 75 so-called projects, which are huge collections of data. And these data have a so-called fairness score, meaning that they are to a high degree possible to find. That depends on how much metadata you have. To access, meaning that you can really get them. They are there for you to access. And so on, interpret and reuse. So this is the best score we have for our data, and in some instances we don't get any higher than this, but it's a good start as well. We have licenses attached to the data that the user chooses exactly what are the conditions that will apply, and chooses a Creative Commons license, which will then, for example, always require that the data must be cited when they are used. This requires collaborations among the institutions that does the curation, ontology, and also the knowledge graph development, shown on the left, and institutions dealing with the storage and the computing, shown on the right. And to make this work, you need support. So we have a high-level support team surrounding these services. And at this point in time, if you go to the HBP website, there is a little button called Get Some Help. And that is your route into this team. This will soon also go now on the eBRAINS portal. And then people can not only access services, but they can also connect to the ones that have developed the services. This is useful for both sides, the feedback aspect and getting help to make sure these things work. HPP has an infrastructure voucher program. This is one of the many openness measures to attract new groups and projects. And the target groups are both academic and clinical, pharma and industry in Europe and also elsewhere in the world. We had 15 voucher projects funded February this year. There was an announcement September this year, or a deadline September this year, announcements in February, and there's more coming. We also have a number of open calls, currently 9 open calls, deadline December 2 to 11, with funding available in each call for 450 to 1,000 or to 1.3 million euro. So these are examples of the key openness measures for the project. And the partnering projects, of course, 23 of them at the moment, recruited to primarily FLAG ERA, which is a new funding mechanism demonstrating how the HPP has influenced the total situation for neuroscience in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. I think we have time for one question from the audience. Otherwise, I would like to remind you that there will be a Q&A session after all the speakers have talked in the second half of today's event.
Thank you, Jan. This is very exciting. So we're not members of the HPP currently. We're coming from the Erasmus MC in Rotterdam precisely because we're curious about the EBRAINS platform. And in the context of the call for expression of interest that has just been released, we are intending to work together with the developers of the simulator platform Arbor, and so to make the best use of the EBRAIN upcoming platforms. I just checked the site, and it's promising, but it says here in the bottom, it's like coming soon to EBRAINS. Additional services will include brain modeling and simulation and supercomputing access. And I wanted to ask, what would you recommend to us? That's question number one. Like, how do we best create synergies as an external partner? And the second one is, so do you imagine a workflow that we can integrate in this context?
Thank you very much for these very important questions. So first of all, this is a launch, a pre-launch. There are many services coming. If we look to what you bring up, yes, EBRAINS will be able to tell how you from the outside can connect to services of the kind you mentioned. It doesn't at the moment. At this point in time, the humanbrainproject.eu website is the place to go. You'll find essential information there as well. It is not prepared 100% for the outside because it's a project site. But that is the way to go. What is the general recommendation for everyone who has these kind of thoughts and ideas and want to connect is simply to use the high-level support team to connect. There is a support function. There is also, as we emphasize at the bottom of the eBrains.eu website, support at. And please use it because this is important for you and it's important for us in the project. Do that.
I can just second that. As a member of high-level support team, you can send an email to support@ebrains.eu or support@humanbrainproject.eu, so it will come into the same system. And for you, it will be also interesting to hear the talk about HPC later today.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Jan. Yeah, okay, we have time for one more question, maybe.
My question is, if you make experiments with robots in real time, you need a very fast connection to the platform if you want to study learning or others. Do you think there is any possibility one day to do this? The links today are terribly slow.
Well, what I can say, we for sure have the competence in the room to answer the question. I guess you're bringing up the question, how much do you want to bring processes together at one location and how much can you distribute? Yeah. Exactly. Well, the general answer to these challenges, the way I see it, is that we will do as much as we can using all these slower connections, but we have to realize what cannot be done with those slower connections where you have to bring everything to the same location. A little bit in parallel with the situation with very large data sets, we do want to bring the tools and services to the data sets, and that's why we want to have them located at places where there is computing power, so we don't rely on all these traffic, so to speak. So depending on where you are along the timeline regarding technology developments, I would say.
Thank you very much, Jan. Yes, and now I would like to welcome Professor Petra Witter from Charité, Berlin. And Petra is working on something very fascinating, whole brain modeling, called the Virtual Brain Platform. Please, Petra.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today in Heidelberg and to introduce to you the virtual brain. And I would like to start with showing you my own virtual brain. Maybe we can turn off the light a little bit, then you even see the surface of my head and my face. So this is my virtual brain. It's very colorful, as you can see. The colors indicate different regions with different functional roles for brain processing. And it's very slow, actually. You have a slow computer, so I think we will not wait. Here you see the first simulation. This is a simulation of EEG projected on the scalp, on the surface of my head. And here you see a simulation of activity projected on cortical activity, on the cortex, sorry. So what is the virtual brain? The virtual brain is a simulation platform. It's open source, and it actually went public for the first time in 2012, 1 year before the Human Brain Project started. And since then, as you can see here, this is a website, and everybody here in the room can go there and immediately download the software and install it on their computer. It runs also on the Human Brain Project Collaboratory. In the future, it will also be integrated in EBRAINS. But if you are impatient, you can just go there and get it. And since 2012, we had more than 23,000 downloads. So this is quite a lot, and several publications now emerged from authors that some of the core development team members do not even know. So that's a very nice development. So what is brain simulation? All of you know computer games, I'm pretty sure. And in computer games, often the world is simulated in more or less detail and with more or less realism. And this is basically what we are doing with the brain. We are simulating the brain. We are not just generating static pictures or models of the brain, but we are making those models actionable. We simulate the activity, the function of the brain. And how we do this, I show you with my colleague Jessica Palmer. This is Jessica and her brain. And you see now her brain without hair or the head. So we reconstruct the head surface. Next, we reconstruct the surface of the brain. We also reconstruct all the nerve fibers in the brain from magnetic resonance imaging data. And then we parcellate the brain in different functional units. And each unit is now represented by a population model, by a set of typically differential equations, and they're interacting through the individual structural connectome. And such a model then can generate activity, field potentials, population firing, EEG, MEG, functional magnetic resonance imaging activity, whatever you can measure in a real brain. And importantly, the virtual brain brings together computational neuroscience and imaging. So it enables us to make the computational models personal, individual. Here you see some of my colleagues and their virtual brains. So we can generate individual brain models for healthy persons and for patients. And not only for human brains, we can construct brain models and run simulations, but maybe even more important for animal brains as well. So this is a monkey brain in the virtual brain platform. And one goal is to, it doesn't work. So the monkey should be animated, but he does not move here. One goal is to decrease the number of animal experiments by doing the simulations on the computer and developing most of the theories on the computer, and then only addressing very targeted key questions that really cannot be solved without experiments. So now you might be aware of the fact that we are not able to simulate the brain with all its detail. It's similar to the computer games. There we also lack a lot of detail. It's the same with the brain. The brain consists of 100 billion neurons, and no supercomputer of the world can run these complex interactions of so many neurons. So what we do is we do a simplification, an abstraction. We construct a model, and we take benefit of a phenomenon which is very common in nature, which is a synchronization. So here you see memorations of starlings, and here these are no birds, these are neurons in the phase space that is spanned by the membrane potential and by the opening probability of the ion channels. And you see that the neurons behave very similar to the birds, so they're synchronizing. And here is a little red cross. This is the mean field approximation. The mean field approximation is a method in statistical physics in order to describe the behavior of interacting elements. So now we have a reduced description, a more simple description of the behavior of this group of interacting elements. And this is what we use. So each of the regions in the brain is represented by a population model, by a mean field approximation of the activity of the behavior of a large group of neurons. So this is one model. You can select many different models. You don't have to choose this one. And here you see the microscopically detailed network. So basically this population model represents or describes in a reduced way the behavior that we could observe in a microscopically detailed model. Now they're interacting, the population models are interacting through the individual reconstructed connectome. This is the graphical user interface of the software. It's very easy to use. Very nice tool if, for example, students, medical students who have not a strong background in mathematics or computer science, very easily can get started with simulating brain activity by using this graphical user interface. Of course, there's also a script interface. So here you see, for example, the connectome viewer. You can manually remove or add some nodes and connections. You can strengthen and weaken connections and see how that affects the activity, the function in the brain. So this is another view of the stimulation cockpit. Here you can apply simulation external currents to the brain, to subsets of regions of the brain, and see how the dynamics are changing in the brain when you stimulate certain structures. And here you see another animal model. This is a mouse brain. It's also possible to simulate rat and mouse brains in the virtual brain platform. So importantly, you can simulate the activity anywhere in the brain. So you can put virtual electrodes in your brain model and then infer the activity at the site of these virtual electrodes. So now I described to you the basic principle of the virtual brain, and you all know now that we do a lot of reduction and abstraction, but for some questions, for some cognitive functions that our brain generates and also some diseases, this might be too much abstraction, and we need a little bit more detail. And for this, we in the Human Brain Project and EBRAINS are developing the possibility for co-simulation. What does it mean? That means that the model consists of a full brain network, as you can see here, as we have it in the virtual brain, but some of the structures are replaced by more detailed models. So here, for example, we are interested in learning. And learning depends on the function in the hippocampus, the entorhinal cortex, and also getting modulated by dopaminergic structures in the midbrain. They're indicated here in red and green and blue. And these structures are represented in this multi-scale model in much more detail. So you see here the same colors. Red represents the hippocampus, blue the entorhinal cortex, and green the dopaminergic midbrain. And here at the microscale, it's getting even more complex. So the connectivity there comes not from non-invasive imaging data. This is impossible to get this data in such detail. It comes from, in this case, the literature. So one of my now postdocs took really a lot of time in order to get all the information out of the publications. And this is one vision also of EBRAINS, to provide all the connectivity data that is available in atlases in a digital form and easily plug it into such models. So now, if we have such a model, we can, for example, explore how a change in the large-scale structure like neurodegeneration, weakening of the connections in the entire brain would impact plasticity mechanisms at the microscopic scale, and vice versa, how a change of plasticity, for example, by dopaminergic modulation, would have an impact on the large-scale dynamics in the brain. So this is now a simulation of the brain of Jessica, and what you see here is we picked one region, actually by chance, and we here show the firing rates of this region of the excitatory and inhibitory mean field. So what we can do by simulating the activity and reproducing the activity that we could also measure, for example, functional magnetic resonance imaging in our subject or patient, we construct a model, a very complex model of the possibly underlying neuronal interactions, local and global interactions. So this is now our new model or theory of how the firing rate in the excitatory and inhibitory populations in all regions of the brain could behave in order to yield our large-scale observations. So by this, we use the virtual brain kind of as a mathematical microscope. Now, since we are able to simulate resting state activity, the brain, when it does not do anything specific, it should be possible, since we can do it on an individual level, to plug in functional circuits. So this is what we really want to understand. How does cognition work in the human brain? And we did that. We constructed 742 virtual brains of the individuals that took part in the Human Connectome Project study. And we plugged in circuits that generate decision-making. So this is a specific model that is able to take or generate decisions. And now we have 742 brain models, and for each of the virtual brains, the individual virtual brains, we also have an intelligence score that was also acquired in the Human Connectome Project. And now we can see how this decision-making functional circuit behaves in each of the individual models. And interestingly, we found that the performance is different. And this is how we learn about how some aspects of intelligence might be implemented in our brain. So this is what we find. It's a little bit a boring slide, maybe. So this is a contrast of the stimulus. Maybe I go back to explain you what you see here. These are two populations, two excitatory competing populations that are getting an input. This is a random dot motion, and I see that the video does not work. So there's a lot of noise, and the dots move in one or the other direction, but it's very difficult to see. And the less easy it is to see, the smaller the contrast of the stimulus. And this is operationalized here by stimulating these two populations, and the one that gets more evidence is a target population. The one that gets less evidence, less activity, is a distractor population. So now here we see the contrast again. And for weak contrast, it's very difficult to decide because there's a lot of noise. Here, this scale, the x-axis, basically shows the different models in which we implement the functional decision-making circuit. And the color indicates the performance. White is perfect performance, and the red and black means the performance is not as good. So now we see by just implementing the circuit in different kinds of brain models, brain avatars, the performance is different. We can move it from red to white, for example, by just changing the brain. And now the question is, what is the rule? So this is still just a correlation and observation, but we really want to understand the mechanisms. And I just want to give you an intuitive feeling how we do this. So this is a phase portrait. This is a mathematical tool, and this is the benefit we have now because the brain is now a mathematical model. We have a pure mathematical description of the processes in the brain. And you see, we have a contrast. The contrast is low. And this is the activity of the two competing populations that you have seen in the previous slide. And now we have 4 scenarios, 4 different brains with different intelligence scores. And the many gray lines here are 1,000 simulations in each of the 4 brains with different intelligence. So 1,000 simulations, 1,000 decisions taken. The orange lines are the averages of those decisions. And we now see that there are differences of the behavior of these averages. So either one population wins or the other population wins. The black bowls are the basins of attraction. When the signal reaches one of those bowls, then a decision has been made. And we see that for the lower intelligence, there is less correlation in the functional connectivity of the brain. The activity of the two populations spends less time in the diagonal. This means in the region that is more balanced. So very quickly, it decides for one or the other solution. While for the higher intelligence brains, we see that the activity stays for longer time at the diagonal. It's for longer time balanced. And this means that the noise, because it's a very weak contrast, is getting integrated, averages out, and all the evidence has more time to accumulate, which leads to a better decision. So this, I hope, gives you an intuitive feeling how we can use those mathematical tools in order to understand how, for example, aspects of intelligence work in our brains. But now I want to switch to patients. How can patients benefit from such simulations? So this is a brain of a stroke patient. As you can easily see here, there's a big lesion in the parietal cortex. And here you can see a diagram where each of the dots represents one patient. And it has been shown in the study by our colleagues in Irvine, now in Dallas, Anna Solotskin, that the parameters that we can infer from the simulations predict the functional outcome for a patient. That means that the physician gets a tool at their hands to tell the patient what the likely perspective in terms of functional recovery will be. So this is very useful. I show another example that was mentioned by Katrin Almunds already in the beginning. This is the virtual brain of a patient with epilepsy. So you see the intracranial electrodes. This is typically done in order to identify the spots where the epileptic activity starts and propagates. And here you see a simulation of a 40-year-old female patient, and you see the seizure activity, this pathological activity, which is darker than the normal activity. And it spreads from one hemisphere over certain regions to the other hemisphere, and then it terminates. So how can the virtual brain help this patient? So 30% of the patients do not respond to drug treatment. And since you all know probably that epilepsy is really not a very nice disease. So for example, you cannot drive a car, which can change your everyday life enormously. The only possibility for those patients to get cured or improvement is neurosurgery, surgery of the brain. And in order to plan this, you need to know, or the neurosurgeon needs to know where the seizure activity starts in the brain and via which pathways it propagates to other regions. And typically, this is getting evaluated by human physicians who look at the data that are recorded in the individual patients. And then based on all the information that is available, this epileptogenic zone, this is how it is termed, is identified. This can be also done with the virtual brain. And here is an example where in red it is shown what the human expert team identified as the epileptogenic zone in one patient. And in green, you see what the virtual brain identified as the epileptogenic zone in one patient. And the yellow is the overlap between the two. So now, a study on several of those patients, I think about 16, showed that the outcome after surgery, which is measured by the angle score. So angle score means 3, there's no improvement, 2, there's some improvement, and 1 means that the individuals, the patients, are seizure-free after surgery. This is indicated on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we see the divergence of the predictions of the human expert team and the computer. And the higher this divergence, the disagreement between the computer and the human physicians was, the poorer was the outcome for the patients. So now, based on these results, a clinical trial has started, has been mentioned by Catherine in France, under the scientific leadership of Victor Gisser, where 400 patients are included. 200 of them are getting treatment, neurosurgical treatment, with additional information on the virtual brain. The other 200 are undergoing neurosurgery without the information provided by the virtual brain. And the trial will last 4 years. At the end of the 4 years, we will see whether brain simulation, in this case, helps the patients or not. Another example of application of the virtual brain is in brain tumors. This is work of Daniel Marinazzo from the University Ghent. They virtualized the brains of patients with brain tumors, and they found that the parameters that they can infer from the simulation can very nicely differentiate between tumor and tumor-free tissue, which is also helpful for the neurosurgeon. Another application is neurodegenerative disease, and here I want to show you how we can integrate other types of data, even in the virtual brains. This is PET data. So in dementia and neurodegeneration, we have an accumulation of certain proteins, beta-amyloid tau protein, and this can be measured with positron emission tomography. And here you see a distribution of beta-amyloid in one brain. So this is a molecular change, a molecular pathway change that now can be integrated in our virtual brain by mapping the burden of the beta-amyloid to some parameters of our population models. And by this, we change the dynamic behavior of the population models. So this is now very mathematical. This is a bifurcation diagram, and it shows the theoretical repertoire of such a population of the brain that I have shown you previously. So what you see here, and I show it to you to get you an intuitive feeling that mathematics really plays a big role in understanding how the brain works. What you see here is the activity of some type of neurons, pyramidal cells, and here on the z-axis you see the activity of another type of neurons, inhibitory interneurons. And in neurodegeneration, it is thought that the coupling between the two types of neurons is disturbed. So here on the x-axis, you see the input from the network, from all the connected regions in the brain. And just by changing the input of the network, you see that the theoretical repertoire of activity of these neurons, inhibitory interneurons and pyramidal cells, changes. So there's very little input. We have a fixed point here. Then if there's more input, we have this blue thing, which is called a limit cycle. So these are so-called manifolds that describe the dynamics of the system that are possible. Here's a little spindle. So there are also oscillations ongoing. I'll show you how this translates then in the activity that we can measure and that we are used to look at in the next slide. So this is now an animated visualization of what I just showed you. With one complicating fact, we also change another parameter. We have not just the changing input from the network in which the population is embedded, but we also change, it's not very well visible, J, the parameter that reflects the local connectivity between the pyramidal cells and the inhibitory interneurons. And by just changing this, and this is very likely impaired, for example, in the vicinity of this beta amyloid, the protein that accumulates in, for example, Alzheimer's disease, we can see how the repertoire of that neuronal population changes. So here, for example, came such a kind of limit cycle, and this is the activity that can evolve now. With this shape, with this geometric shape, you can generate a certain repertoire of signals. And if you change the parameter, either the local connectivity or the input by the network, by all the other regions, you change the repertoire, the possibility the system has to generate certain rhythms. And in this way, we can explain how a slowing of the EEG, of the neural activity, emerges with an increased beta amyloid load or burden, because this is hypothesized to impact the coupling between the inhibitory and the pyramidal cells. So this is how we use mathematics in order to understand the complex interactions in the brain. And here you see, oops, this was too fast, the resulting slowing for Alzheimer's disease patients. So blue is a healthy control, it's normal. And this is the EEG that is simulated. This is ADNI data. It's a big cohort that is also already part, I think, of EBRAINS. So some of the the data are in the repository of EBRAINS. And we see by just including the PET data in our models, we get a slowing of the EEG, of the simulated EEG in the Alzheimer's patients. So we can identify potential mechanisms of how large-scale changes of brain activity can be explained by underlying changes of molecular pathways or even genetic changes. And here I want just at the end to show you that we can also do virtual drug tests on our virtual brains. What we did here is we gave the Alzheimer's disease brain models virtual memantines. This is an NMDA antagonist that is also given to patients with Alzheimer's disease in order to at least temporarily improve their cognitive performance. And if we give this to our virtual patients or virtual brains, you see how the slowing, on the y-axis you see the dominant frequency in the simulated EEG. Alzheimer's disease is red, blue is normal individual. And you see how the virtual memantine increases the EEG, the simulated EEG, and elevates it to a normal baseline, as we can see it in healthy individuals. I want to mention also partnering project of EBRAINS, the Virtual Brain Cloud, that just started also, and that has very similar goals as Jan Bjarle just explained, in making data fair, collecting data of patients from many institutions and integrating them in models. And I think it will be a very fruitful collaboration between EBRAINS and this project in the future. I also want to show you this brain atlas. It's an interactive brain atlas that is available for the public. So it's thought for non-scientists, actually non-neuroscientists, who are interested in the brain, it's available on this website. It has been developed in the Human Brain Project in collaboration with the Bloomfield Museum in Israel and Jerusalem for an exhibition, a traveling exhibition. And it's developed in many languages. So now we have it actually in more languages available. This is an older version here. It's Arabic, Hebrew, German, English. We have it also in Polish. And everybody can interact with the brain and choose certain networks, regions, and get explanations, information. I think this is another very important aspect of eBrains. On the one hand, it brings kind of a revolution in medicine and health because it's for the first time enables to really use data from many different sources. And on the other hand, eBrains and the Human Brain Project also provide a lot of didactic educational information for the broad public. And this is also very important to increase brain health if people are enabled to understand and to know more about their own brain and their own body. And this can be very entertaining. So we have also a funny app that can be downloaded that enables to visualize the brain activity with commercial neuro headsets or do some neurofeedback games. Here my two children, I think this was like 2 or 3 years ago, are playing. He has a headset, the BCI, brain computer interface, on his forehead, and he's controlling this little cat game. They like this cat game very much. So there's entertainment, and there is a serious chance coming with the Human Brain Project and eBrain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra. That was very interesting. I'm sure everyone here would like to play such a game with their own brain activity. So we have time for one question. Otherwise, I would like to ask you to keep the questions for the Q&A session afterwards.
How do you simulate the drug insertion into the virtual brains? So how does the model incorporate the drugs?
You mean the nerve fiber connections that we reconstruct either by diffusion tensor imaging, tractography, or by other techniques? How we integrate that? Is that the question?
I meant the functional, so the aspect how the drugs work.
Under the track, okay. Yeah, so I showed you one example, and this is the only example we have so far, but what one can do is one can modulate the coupling of certain neuronal populations. So we have population models with different degrees of detail. The one I showed you is a Janssen-Witt model that has pyramidal cells, inhibitory interneurons, and excitatory interneurons. And you can modulate the coupling between these different neuron types, and this is what we did.
Okay. Thank you very much, Petra. And I would like to welcome our next speaker, Professor Rüdiger Dillmann from Karlsruhe University. And he will talk about links between neuromorphic and robotics. Please, thank you.
So, thank you very much for being invited to give a talk here. Can you switch on my... Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, we are users of the platform from the Human Brain Project. Our interest is to test functionalities in the brain, connecting it with a robot. So what we are studying actually is where is motion coming from, how to grasp, how to connect the eyes with the motoric part, and to build control systems which are able to run a robot. And of course, it's interesting to study how to learn it, how to train such systems, and which neural models are useful to use. So in the previous talk, it was very interesting to see what type of neurons are studying how to combine them. And the platform, the Neuro platform, which is available, is in eBrain, is offering some robots, environment modeler, and then to some sensors, and then to connect it with brains wherever which part is of interest. Okay, this is where we are looking for. Are neuromorphic principle good for robot control? I can say yes. Neurons are spiking. With spikes, these are signals over time. You can combine them, you can model closed-loop systems, and you can also interface amplifiers with this type of... Okay, it works. So this is introductory. Here we built some walking systems. They are all controlled by neurons, but not spiking one. We did use classical neurons and perceptrons to combine, to make leg synchronizations, to move individual legs, to integrate some sensors, and continued to develop that. There are now robots with muscle models. So we have agonist and antagonist and interface them with a neural part. And it's possible also to move and to move forward, climbing, and some special skills have been trained with this type. We continue to work now. Our working machines are in the 6th generation, and several years we are thank you. We are using spiking neurons for control instead of classical triggering perceptrons, which we used in the first phase. So if you look forward, for which type of robots this is interesting, here you see different robots, and each of them is autonomous. And these systems you see here are all model-based. And we believe that the brain is working different, that it's event-driven, and that prediction is important, and there are some triggering mechanisms to be realized. However, it's possible this is an autonomous system with 2 arms. This is a prototype of a 3-finger system. We continue now to develop 5-finger system. Grasping is very interesting, integrating haptics and the visual perception, and then manipulating objects. So the robots become more and more human-like over time. You see here a system with 5-finger hands with 2 eyes. If we look to the software, here we have about 100,000 lines of codes. Programming this system is about 600,000 lines of codes. And if you go to the humanoid system with 2 arms, 5-finger and eyes, it's more than 1 million lines of codes. To program this is cumbersome. So we are hoping to apply the neurons and the knowledge of the Human Brain Project to plug functional components together in the sense, as in the previous talk, it has been presented, and then to build systems with elements. So even this system is part we are looking for. This has actually 72 joints. A human has much more than 100 joints if you add a spine. Here we have 72 motors. And if you look to the muscles, the main muscle parts for moving the human body is, I think, more than 1,000. And this has to be controlled, to be connected with a skeleton, and then to run a robot. Only to give you an idea what is robotics and what is the brain. Looking to programming, what I mentioned before is most of the systems are textual programmed. It's a tremendous work to generate a code, to test it, to connect it with a machine, to make experiments, and to add some learning capabilities. Then we have this shared programming, which is symbolic and sub-symbolic programming, to go down to the controls. And then these are more classical programming techniques which are used today in robotics in industry or in other applications. Some planners are available, generated automatically programs, the geometric model, kinematic models, and then to generate the system. Strategy graphs, which have a limited point of view to predict and to compute what is adequate reaction and what to do. These are planners. And then how to generalize the programs so that the robot can do not only one task, but maybe tasks in a changing world and to adapt. Alternatives are, of course, sub-symbolic programming. And so we think that neural programs are useful for certain applications. I will show you some examples. What is done today is end-to-end trajectory, move from A to B, or walk from A to B. This is existing. You can apply reinforcement learning, policy learning, which requires some abstraction to do this type of work. And reinforcement learning are some mechanisms. We believe that in the brain this is used. It's a multi-level reinforcement learning. The question is how to optimize locally so that globally we can achieve good results. Then learning predictive models is very important. If you do anything, for example, playing table tennis, you must predict what happens. What will be the next action? If you play tennis or if you do other things, prediction is steering the focus of interest of the perceptive systems. You look to things which are relevant for the next action, and then the brain computes that. The question is how to generate programs, neural programs automatically, or maybe they are to be learned, to find some structures, to use the plasticity and to form a functional unit with adequate weights. And then, of course, functional neural networks, spiking networks are possible to train them to use the plasticity and to build controllers, control loops, open loop, closed loop controls, different ways. Okay, the question is now, is this useful for robots? This was the first question. Can we apply that, what we learn in the human brain to robots? And we want to show that. And we want to convince industry that there is hardware and software available actually, and this can be used. It's not easy, but there are some companies really interested in to go into that field. So the dream is, of course, to have low power for these systems, approximating low power of the brain to make the system more reliable. How to exploit a high connectivity in the plasticity to train these systems. And then, these are all problems to be solved. How to integrate sensor motor information to move the hand, to move the muscles, to reach a goal or to interact with the environment. Then time is important, triggering at the right time the actions. So with spiking neurons, it's much better than with classical neural nets. There you need synchronization mechanisms, and with the spikes you have automatically synchronization mechanism. And the question is, what about adaptive control? Sometimes a robot needs position control, trajectory control, force control, impedance control. So there are a lot of different controllers. Depending on the actual situation, the brain is able to activate and to deactivate them and have smooth transitions between the ways. So for control engineers, this is a very interesting field to have this plasticity, adaptivity. We call it multi-structural controls, not parametric controls. Okay, and then how it could be realized, how to work with them. Is there some deep learning mechanism there, and how we have to train? So some assumptions have to be done, which are important when modeling such systems. This is how to train neural networks. Is this backpropagation over which time area? Do we have short memory? Do we have long memories? And the other one is how to process the synapses and the neurons, how to exploit the plasticity rules or how to apply plasticity rules, and then which type of learning and from global point of view we are studying. Okay, this is the engineering part. Before, but it must be made clear if you want to run a robot with spiking neurons and to implement and to study functional areas of the brain. One is to link it to the perceptive part. The other one is to link it to the motor part, which may be localized in the cerebellum, but it has to be connected with the visual part. Okay. Then what type of neurons? There are a lot of neurons. Neurons which can be implemented in a technical point of view have 3-4 parameters, but if you look closer to the neurons, it's much more complex, but we are looking to have some working. The frequency for real control is about 100 hertz, so it's a small bandwidth control, but exploiting high parallelism and then some kind of logic. Here are examples what nature can do that, and with I think a limited number of neurons, but it's fantastic what this being can do. Beans weighs nearly 1 million. Also here, the mouse, which is studied in the neurorobotics project, the brain, which to coordinate the limbs and to use the whiskers and to use the smell. Here in the atlas, there are 75 million neurons, and there are maps, and part of that is already computed in a brain platform. And then if you look to humans, this was already said, this is a huge number. If you go to the connectivity, which is much higher, this is extremely difficult, even if you have several supercomputing centers to program that and to learn with that. Okay, this was already said. What we are studying, we are not from robotics side on the molecular level. There we get maybe some parameters of the model. But we are interested in one cell. We are interested in circuits, functional circuits, to compute them and to train them. They are, of course, related in region. And there are now a lot of interfaces to the projects in the human brain where we work with the individual research groups. So where it's interesting, this was also said, neurocomputing, computing itself. These are different paradigms to today's computing, and medicine neuroscience was already mentioned in the previous talks. So which type of neuron is the right one? Of course, we said it should be in some way plausible so that we have the threshold, that we have relaxation times, that we have the amplification, basic functions. And the models we are using actually are simplified to that one. We would like, if we have adequate hardware, to simulate and then to simplify them, as you see here in this analog circuit, which allows to general spiking trains, incoming trains, outgoing threshold, and amplification. So that's one part. And if you look for humanoid robots and trying to make a robot learning what is observed, the technique is more or less programming by demonstration. We observe a human doing something, grasping, moving, walking, playing table tennis. Then to map it on a model. One is possible to have a realistic skeleton model, but this is a high-dimensional space. So at the beginning, we simplify that. And then we map the sensor data to our motor controls, to spiking neural networks, and train them till they are doing this, what has been observed, and it's a type of replication. This does not mean that it's already learned, but we can replicate that. And the last one is then to make tests with real robots. Here is one robot from Italy. This is a robot for research, a humanoid one with 2 legs, spine, 2 arms, 5 finger hands. And the other one is to have robots, as you have seen before, and studying the spiking networks and making the experiments. This shows you the visual part. This is a data set from IBM, which is processed here. The idea is to show how fast a computer can identify in an image known object, a cat, a tiger, an animal, or a person, and then to compute that. Let's repeat. So these are images, and within seconds, the brain can recognize these objects, and we are testing that. How artificial eye, a camera, how fast this can be processed to identify that. And we have done that with a spiking camera. It's a dynamic vision system, a camera from Switzerland, which we are using for this test. Okay, why spiking neurons are of interest? Instead of bytes and code, and conversion of signals into digital representation, we only use spikes. It means we can work on the joint level, on the muscle level, on the percept level, and generating these trains. We have the threshold. It's a very simplified model, and we can fire. We have the time instant, and we can combine most of them. We can use the plasticity and to inhibit or to accelerate the system. So the question is how to compute that, and which type of neuromorphic computing is of interest. You heard today the Spinnaker systems and the brain scale systems. There are also others worldwide under development which could be applied. So typical experiment is when this is a toolbox, a framework, and what we are interested in is if we study motion, and the visual part is one, of course, to make use of the camera data. What is important to have something like an episodic memory. If you observe something, it must be stored. So we assume there are cells in the brain which are able to store. Structural plasticity is important. And then, of course, some mechanism to learn motion primitives, and then to use a tool, a framework where we are using a liquid state machine, which allows to exploit the plasticity of the individual neurons. Here is the hardware, the robot experiment, building the interface. You can, of course, also simulate part of that. But the robotics is like to see experiments. Here you see the camera. This is the dynamic vision camera. Each pixel is represented by a spiking train. What you see here is a data set from IBM to evaluate the camera, fast movements. What the camera is doing, it don't make stationary images, it only fires if there are movements, fast movements. And then for each pixel where movement is detected, a spiking train is generated. We are using that for predicting, learning, and then generating movements. Classically means to adapt this image. And if you use spiking train, you have only spikes. So you have no more this conversion into digital format of the whole trajectory in the image. We use only for significant changings in the image spiking trains to work with, which makes the system extremely fast. Okay, how to learn is that we use different camera. We have a data set, objects to train the system. Then we have here object prediction, error prediction. This means to modify the environment because there is noise and other disturbances. Labeling the object to identify what it is. And then we have a circuit, neural circuit, where it's possible to compute. Okay, and then after training, there's a testing phase where we have a robot arm, 5-finger hand, and the camera, and showing you how it can learn. The neurons which are used, we call them label neuron, error neuron. Then we have the learning neuron itself, and then input-output neurons, which are integrated in such a circuit in the functionality, and then showing you how it works. This is a movie. This is the basic mathematics used for calculating the input of the neuron. Where's the movie? Wow, that's not rough. It's my key movie. We tested it, but it... Okay, starting again. No. Okay. Ah, yeah. Thank you. So these are showing different objects to the robot. So here you see the output of the camera. You get only pixels if there is some movement. If the camera wants to see the object, it has to apply saccades to move the eyes in X and Y to get the images. Humans are doing that, exploiting saccades. And here you see that if the eye moves, you see the firing neurons. So we call that micro saccades, and we have macro saccades, but we are using that here in the form of micro saccades. It's 3 per second is possible. And I think humans have about 8 saccades per second to identify the environment. Okay, the system is trained, it's labeled, then the operator is modifying its position so that we have noise. And then the second step is to reduce the noise and then to continue the training phase. Okay, that's the reason why the object is moved in a small original environment, so that we have not one-to-one imaging, but we have a noisy environment of objects of this kind. Okay, then the background is labeled with the camera, so we can subtract the background, also using the saccades, and then concentrating, focusing to the area of interest. And then finally, we go to the evaluation, that the recognition of the object is triggering grasping. And here you can see the spiking trains, and then the recognition. This is difficult for ordinary vision systems to identify transparent objects. And then left and right cameras is processed, can observe its own hand, and then grasping that. This is one example. Industrial robot can do that much better. This is optimized, but this is learned and is used to show the principle. So what we have done in the project is to use industrial components to show that we can run with spiking controls and with neural biomorphic structures. 6 degrees of freedom is a lightweight arm, and then using a 5-finger hand. And so the ICAP robot, this is the small humanoid from the IIT, Italian Institute of Technology. There, it's planned in the last phase of the project to integrate that. Okay, you see grasping the object. The first is to classify, to localize, and then to grasp. And grasping itself is trained, and in the future we will use haptics. Okay, now these are the details. I think time is too short to explain that. But what is done is to explain the multi-layer training which is used. It's a backpropagation mechanism where from level to level, local backpropagation and optimization is done. And we have shown that we can manage types of this benchmark from IBM to test that. Okay, the learning curve, I cannot go into details. Important is that you know the characteristic of the motor primitives, what has to be learned to approach the object, to open the hand, to have contact or to grasp, and which signals from the cognitive level are necessary for that. These are some details how you can train that using the simulator. You can find it on the platform of the neurorobotics platform, loading down one robot, loading a training procedure, and then to reach objects or to train different motions, you can select neurons, neural networks, and learning the motion, the basic movements in this system. Okay, target reaching, then there is a motion with contact. For example, if the robot has to touch on walls or to open a door, it's important to get a contact or to have repetitive motions, cyclic motions. They can have been studied with individual nets, so where the liquid state machines has been applied to learn and to use the plasticity. Okay, finally, you can plan obstacle-free motions, for example, preventing a human to have collision with a robot. This means that a camera or the robot is observing the human, and that motion is immediately generated, which avoids collisions. And there we designed a 3D memory, which is implemented with spiking neurons, one where the robot identifies its own body, and the second memory where the robot identifies the volume of an obstacle or of humans working with that. And then we show how to process this. Stereo mode is possible, calibration. Instead of these curves, we have only spikes. And you can calibrate the camera so that it's possible to localize the object and then to generate a movement collision-free to reach it. Okay, finally, these are some experiments how this memory looks like, how to compute the voxels. You can also plan collision-free paths. There are different algorithms how to exploit that. And finally, there is the message that we can accelerate the individual processing time up to real time. I heard that brain scale chips are too fast, and we have to slow them, but I think we have enough to compute so that we can make a good use of them. So this was a short survey on robotics, how we use it in the brain. Again, we are not, what we are looking for individual aspects like motion, like motoric part, like the visual part, how to connect that, focus of interest. There are, of course, other things if you have a complex task, which is much more difficult to store in the brain. So we are looking for basic mechanisms, and you are invited to go in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit out of time, so I would like to offer you to keep the questions for the Q&A session afterwards. And now we have half an hour break. You can enjoy some coffee in the foyer and have some discussions with the speakers or with your colleagues. So we meet here 15:05.
Hello, Björn. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Dear Lars, it works. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Fine.
And back to the room.
Dear all, welcome again to the second part of our event. And now we will have a very interesting talk from Professor Dirk Pleiter from Research Center Jülich, and he will talk about high-performance computing. Please, Dirk.
Okay, thank you very much. So this needs a bit switching gears after the break. Well, of course, before the break, more about research being done and on, say, infrastructures and technologies, which somehow need to be there in order to be able to carry out this research. This is now more about, say, the underlying technologies and infrastructures. And it's not only about HPC, it's also about, say, how to store data and how to provide also, say, and use cloud technologies to simplify the access to these kind of resources. So let me start from, say, a top-down approach and start with, say, what are the concepts behind, say, an IT, distributed IT infrastructure, which we call Phoenix. And I mean, you will probably recognize, say, a few of the things which have been, say, mentioned earlier, particularly also in Jan Joli's talk. So what we, say, are putting in place is a set of infrastructure services which can serve multiple communities. So it is in particular including, say, the brain research community. And we do that by, say, having this kind of layer approach, as it is shown in this picture, where you have the users from the different communities here in the top. And they are not necessarily directly accessing the infrastructure services. So basically think about it as being, say, more the bare metal, but they are using, say, platform services like the ones which are putting in place by EBRAINS. So it is about, say, providing a federated infrastructure services to support then platform services. And that is basically the part I'm talking about that is here at the bottom, where we have different infrastructure services, where infrastructure services can be compute services, can be data store services. And what we, say, want to achieve here is that while all these services are provided by different sites, that they are federated. So we also need to have services which allow or facilitate this federation, so that you have, say, an uniform access to these services. And what it buys you also is what we call a composability of these services. So it's not this classical approach of an HPC center providing, say, a large-scale system, and then you submit jobs via a batch queuing system. It is about providing, say, a set of different services, which you then can combine in different ways, possibly even, say, distributed over different sites. And you have already in Katrin Amund's talk seen a very brief example of how things can actually be extended over different sites. And the last important aspect is that we are not looking for, say, a unique implementation of these services, because it's very important to make sure that you're not entering into a technology or vendor lock. So that is something which we carefully try to avoid. So now let's look what are the kind of services which we try to put in place. Now let's start with, say, the computing services. And that obviously includes also, say, things like, say, scalable computing services, which is about high-performance computing, but it's also about adding new types of services which are not necessarily so typical in today's infrastructures, like having, for instance, interactive access to HPC systems, and also to have it tightly coupled with more cloud type of compute services, like, for instance, the service to host virtual machines. Then there are the data services. I will explain later what it means in terms of having, say, different types of data repositories. And it's not only about providing data repositories, but it's also providing services which allows them to locate data or to move then data between these different data repositories. And then finally, we have, in order to federate that, we need common authentication and authorization infrastructure, and we have to find the ways of how to actually manage the users in the system, to manage projects there, so that we can, say, for instance, assign resources to a project and in a distributed infrastructure, and to also track on what kind of resources are being consumed if, say, a project is not using only resources at one site A, but maybe also at the site B. And that is, say, a very high-level picture. So you have the different types of compute services, you have different type of storage services, and they are, of course, then interconnected by networks, possibly, say, very fast networks. So now getting more concrete. So currently, we have 5 supercomputing centers which are involved in this building up the Phoenix infrastructure. And they are, as you can easily see from this list, they are very much distributed all over Europe, starting from the Barcelona Supercomputing Center in the south of Spain in Barcelona, then having, say, the French Supercomputing Center near Paris, the Italian Supercomputing Center in Bologna, the Swiss Supercomputing Center in Lugano, so close to the Italian border, and then in Germany, the Jülich Supercomputing Center is involved where I'm coming from. Now, even so we start from supercomputing center, I think it's always important to stress this is first of all not meant to be, say, a closed club. So we, say, deliberately design things in a way that it can be extended, and it can also be extended to non-supercomputing sites. So that really depends on the kind of services which are required. It's just how things also evolved. Now, you might ask the question, I mean, why is it beneficial to actually have a distributed infrastructure? Because it adds a lot of complexity, right? I mean, it would be sometimes much simpler, I mean, to have everything on one side. Now, there is, say, for most, the aspect of having data locality. In particular, in the Human Brain Project, we have, say, a number of projects which are producing tremendous amounts of data. So we're talking here about petabytes of data. And you don't want this to be, say, just moved around, right? I mean, even though we have fast networks, I mean, they have their limitations, and so it is much more preferable to have the data processing done where the data is actually also available. Then you can also, in certain cases, think about making services available at different sites, and in this way, your availability will increase. Then certainly, when, say, putting infrastructure in place at different locations, you will also see a larger diversity of the provisioned services. So at the 5 different sites, we are not going to put in place, say, exactly the same, say, infrastructure. It's conceptually the same kind of services, but behind it, the implementations are different. So it includes, say, in part, say, smaller clusters, which are more, say, useful for having, say, distributed tasks. But it also, for instance, at CSDS, we'll come back to this point later, includes a tier 0 supercomputer. So where you can scale out simulations to thousands of nodes. Then one thing, I mean, not to be underestimated, I mean, like in many other advanced technology fields, experts are scarce. So being able to pool experts and to have different kind of expertise at different sites is also, say, an important benefit. And the last point which I would like to highlight is also the sustainability of the overall infrastructure. Even so there is a certain amount of diversity, I mean, there's also quite a significant amount of similarity of, say, the services which are provided by a different site. So if for whatever reason, because funding stops, one site has to drop out, it will be possible to plug in another site, and it does not necessarily affect, say, the user's view. So this helps to, say, sustain the overall effort. Now let's look in some of the services in a bit more detail, starting with the compute services. Now, as already highlighted, I mean, we continue to provide, of course, what is our core expertise as supercomputing centers to provide scalable compute services. So this is for scalable, jobs, like for instance simulations, where you can say you're not using only one node, but use maybe say even thousands of nodes in order to address very large-scale problems. And one of the things which we hope to also add at some point, that there's a certain amount of elasticity also in there, which is something in capability which we don't have as of today. Then there's something new which you don't find, say, in typical HPC centers, that are interactive compute services. So that's basically the ability that you just can log into a single server, have then, say, the view on all your data so that you can interactively process your data, and maybe also use interactive frameworks like Jupyter notebooks. And then finally, say, the virtual machines. So this is really about putting, like you know, say from cloud providers, to allow users to put their fully customized environment onto virtual machines, and have them, as such, of course, full control. Now, this is not necessarily, typically not for an end user, but this is meant to, say, deploy platform services. Now, next to data services. Here we decided conceptually to make a distinction between two types of data stores. And the first one are, say, the archival data repositories. And their important feature is that they are going to be federated and allow for sharing of data. So they are meant to hold file data products, to also hold them over longer periods of time, and they are going to be accessible through a Swift interface and are integrated into an AAI. Now, for those who are familiar with, say, object stores like Swift, but also think about Ceph, know that these are, say, not data stores which you want to access from a massively parallel HPC systems. It would be way too slow. That would be not a good idea. So that's why we introduced basically a second type of storage, which we call active data repositories. There you can hold private copies of your data, and you have then data mover services, which allows them to move data between these two different worlds. And that is, say, also shown here in this picture. So here, down here, an archival data repository with a Swift interface from where you can have a federated access. Then you have an active data repository, which typically we translate into a parallel file system, as those who have been using HPC systems so far know. And from here you can then, with a high performance, connect to scalable compute services, and you have a data mover service which, say, allows to move data between these two different worlds. And in the interactive computing services, because there we are not in the highly parallel world, we can allow to access both types of data repositories. Now, how does it look like with the federation of these services? And that's where it becomes, say, technically and also organizationally, say, most challenging, is how do we facilitate that users who have access to one of the sites can have access to any of the other sites. And there has been, say, a lot of experience, say, collected with that in say, a world which is called, say, the World Wide Grid. In particular, say, LHC has done, say, quite some pioneering work, but the solutions where they came up were essentially, say, to some extent, say, proprietary solutions, and there's now, say, a trend, and that's what we now also following in terms of the high-performance computing centers, is to use standard industry protocols, right? So that we are, say, compatible also what is done in industry and follow there the technology development. And our approach is here that we say, okay, we trust, and sorry, one of the challenges which you have here is that for a user which gets assigned with a virtual identity, how can we be sure that this virtual identity indeed belongs to a user? I mean, we could go, say, for Google as an identity provider. At least there is a supposed relation with, say, a cell phone number that gives you, say, at least a little bit of trust, but it's certainly not enough, I mean, in order to give you, say, access to very valuable and partially also export restricted technology. So that's where we have also in the future to be, say, careful about that. So that's why we decided, okay, we trust basically the identities which are provided by the Supercomputing Center, and then these ones are federated, but we also allow for other identities, but maybe not for all kinds of operations. Then what we secondly need is to also have the ability to manage users, to understand is a user, for instance, part of a certain community to manage, say, resources, but also to be able to store additional attributes for a user. So that is, for instance, important to manage, for instance, access control to the data, which is a key aspect when you are, say, sharing data in a federated infrastructure. And for this, we put, say, something in place which we call, say, the Phoenix User and Resource Management Service, which is then together with the AI and a central proxy for the identity providers, say, the key components for, say, the federation of this infrastructure. Now, one thing which I would like to highlight, and I will come back to it at the end, is so far, whatever I have presented are, say, very generic concepts, right? It's not, say, something which we do very specific by the community because it is supposed to service also different kinds of communities. So far I have talked about concepts, and now let me take you through, say, some of the things which are already in place as of today. I will not take you, given the amount of a little time, in all the details of this graph. It just shows you that in practice, if you look at an HPC center, say the implementation can be quite complex, but you might still recognize some of the components which I was talking about earlier. So for instance, here you have at CSCS large-scale supercomputer. So that is the one which provides scalable compute services. It actually also allows to then use it for interactive compute. You just get allocated with a single node. Through the internal network, you have then access to all kinds of data repositories, including then also the ones which we then label as being active or archival data repositories. And you have here an OpenStack cluster, which allows you then to deploy VMs. So in this sense, you can see in a concrete implementation, you can find back, say, the conceptual elements of the architecture presented earlier. So looking at even more concretely, I mean, what we currently, say, can offer to the users is access to, say, the fastest, according to the top 500 metric, computer which we have in Europe, PITS-Dyned, which comprises of two types of nodes. There is on the one hand the PITS-Dyned multi-core partition, where you have nodes where each node has 2 CPUs. And there's actually the larger partition, which is called PITS-Dyned Hybrid, where each of the nodes comprises of 1 CPU and 1 GPU. And since there are, say, more than 5,000 of these, I mean, this gives you, say, enormous, say, compute power in the tens of petaflop. And you can see here in this picture that's actually not 1 node, it's actually 4 nodes. So you have here 4 CPUs and 4 GPUs. And on top of that, there are, of course, active data repositories in terms of a Lustre parallel file system and an archival data repository, which is accessible through a Swift interface and allows people then to store petabytes of data. So with all these resources in place, the question, of course, arises of how do we make these resources available and how is this allocation process? And for this, we introduced a concept which we call Phoenix credits. A Phoenix credit is, you can also think about it as a kind of a voucher for, say, consuming resources. And each credit has essentially 4 attributes. It is valid only for one site. So it's not, say, a universal currency, and you can, say, easily exchange it between different sites. Otherwise, for us, planning of resources would be, say, become very difficult. Then it is for, say, a given class of resources, for instance, scalable compute, interactive compute, VMs, or different types of data stores. It has, of course, a value, and it has a validity period. So, of course, what you don't want to have as a structure operator is that a project gets a lot of Phoenix credits, waits until the end of the project, and then wants to consume everything, right? I mean, so here we mandate that there is some reasonable consumption of the resources over the time. Now, these credits are provided by us as resource providers to communities. And how much it is, that depends on, say, the funding scheme. And I will come back to what it means in the case of the Human Brain Project. And it's then these Phoenix communities which have to decide which projects are getting these credits, right? That's not the business of the resource providers. So this is something where we are very careful in delegating that. And the way of how, at least currently, this has to be done by these communities is by means of a peer review process. So in order to make sure that these very expensive resources are used in the best possible way. And it's then up to the community to have a process in place which allows them to determine whether a project is indeed excellent. Now, this is not, say, our decision. I mean, this is basically something which is mandated by the funding agency, which wants to get, say, value for, say, the money which is invested. You could, in future, also, say, think about different kind of mechanisms of how this is actually done. I mean, there's virtual access models, there's pay-per-use models. So these kind of things might come. I can only say reflect what is, say, the current state. And specifically from the infrastructure which we have in place right now, we as resource providers are obliged to provide 25% of the resources to the Human Brain Project. That may be not only, say, the members within the Human Brain Project, but also, say, other neuroscientists, but it's essentially the allocation mechanism is run by the Human Brain Project. Another 15% goes to PRAISE and is through that mechanism distributed at European users at large. And the remaining 60% are then distributed to local users through national mechanisms. They are typically all with the same kind of principles, meaning that based on a peer review, judging about the excellence of a project, resources get be assigned. So finally, let me quickly, since I have 0 minutes, quickly take you through 2 examples to really show also what is, say, the benefits of having, say, this composability of these different resources. So one of the first things we currently have running is a simulation of a hippocampus. And at the end, it's not only about, say, the simulation, which requires, say, scalable computing services, but you have to also analyze the resulting data, where you need an interactive services. You have to store the final data product, and then you might want to offer access to this final data products then to users through, for instance, web-based visualization services. So to give you a summary and outlook, so Phoenix is a very generic concept to provide, say, access to e-infrastructure services, and it can, say, service multiple communities. We have now an initial infrastructure running and also the allocation processes in place so that researchers can apply for resources. Currently, the service portfolio is provided by 5 supercomputing centers, but in order to stress it again, in the future, we expect other, say, resource providers to join, and we also hope that other types of resources will be included into this infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dirk. I wonder if we have time for one question, and other questions would be kept for Q&A session afterwards.
Very quick one. So where should I go right now to get the resources?
It depends a bit on currently. I mean, we have to distinguish whether you are in HPP or whether you're outside of HPP. So for within HPP, I can give you an email address. We have a very short, you can also find it on the Phoenix website, say in description, and pointers to where you find in the collaboratory also templates for, say, writing, depending on the amount of resources you're asking for, a very short or maybe a little bit longer application, because somebody has to just about what is the excellence of the project. For PRAISE, we there will, and this is actually a continuous call, so you can basically submit a proposal at any time. For PRAISE, there will be 4 times a year, there will be calls, and the call is now basically about to open it every day, any day. There was a bit of a shortage in personnel in the PRAISE office in Brussels. Well, we last week had our big annual conference with Supercomputing. So I can excuse the people there.
Thank you very much. So, and I would like to welcome our next speaker, Professor Steve Ferber from University of Manchester. You already heard a little bit about linking the neuromorphic to robotics, and now Steve would talk, will take a deep dive into neuromorphic computing.
Oh, I'm wired. Yeah, it won't be a very deep dive because I've only got 20 minutes. So a superficial overview of neuromorphic computing and its role in the Human Brain Project. So the Human Brain Project from the outset had these goals of understanding the brain, that's the science goal, understanding diseases of the brain, which is the medical goal, and developing future computing, which is the technology goal. And the most obvious manifestation of the future computing agenda is this development of neuromorphic computing. Now, within the HBP, there are two neuromorphic computing platforms, the Spinnaker machine, which is hosted at Manchester in the UK, and the BrainScales machine, which is hosted in a concrete building somewhere near here. I don't know which way to point, actually. I'm not quite sure where that way. Okay, somewhere over there, not far from here. Both Spinnaker and BrainScales were developed before the start of the HBP. They were effectively brought into the HBP, and within the HBP, development of software support and the service on these machines has continued to evolve. And we've also put a lot of resource into developing second-generation neuromorphic platforms, which will emerge over the next phase of HBP and beyond. Now, these two platforms have quite different properties. They really represent opposite ends of the neuromorphic scale. So the Spinnaker machine is a many-core platform. Neurons are modeled in software, synapses or other bits of software. So in effect, it's like a simulation. The neuromorphic aspect of the machine is the way we connect the cores together, which allows us to maintain real-time biological spiking neural network modeling over a very large scale. The BrainScales machine adopts the more, if you like, traditional neuromorphic approach of looking at the equations that govern the evolution of the biological parameters and finding analog electronic circuits which implement the same equations. And there are very strong analogies, for example, between ion channels in biological neurons and between the currents that flow in transistors at subthreshold regions. And so the equations are mapped into analog circuits, and therefore this is described as physical emulation. And both of these systems have been designed and built from the transistor up, so both the Manchester and Heidelberg groups and our supporters, particularly at TU Dresden, have a strong background in silicon design, and this is the primary skill that we bring to this game. Now, of course, we aren't the only neuromorphic systems. Neuromorphics was conceived as a topic first by Carver Mead in the 1980s at Caltech. Industry is also involved, and on roughly the same timescale as Spinnaker and BrainScales, IBM has developed the True North system, and rather more recently, Intel has developed their Loihi neuromorphic platform. And you can see a scale from software at the left to analog circuits at the right. The models are more biologically realistic as you go to the right, and the ease of use improves as you go to the left. And so there's a kind of trade-off in this neuromorphic world of realism versus ease of use. And the platforms have quite different strengths and application domains, which makes them highly complementary within the HBP. So it's important to know that the timescales here are long. Developing large-scale computer systems isn't something that you can do even within a 10-year project. And both BrainScales and Spinnaker have been in work for nearly 20 years now and will continue into the future. So you can see there was a lot of work before HBP, which really positioned the two groups. In fact, here at Heidelberg, Karl-Heinz Meyer, who led the BrainScales operation, was one of the co-proposers with Henry Markram of the HBP. So neuromorphics was a component, and it was an important component, and it built on the work that had already been done at Heidelberg. And we at Manchester had formed links with Heidelberg in an earlier EU project, and we came in and joined the HBP with our system. And these things will carry on into the future in who knows what shape or form. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the platforms that we have and what they can do. Firstly, I'm going to look at the first generation machines. These are the machines which existed before the HBP and were brought in from the outset. And these are offered as an open service within the HBP. So if you want to run a job on Spinnaker, there's none of this complicated bidding and getting peer reviewed. You just join the HBP community, sign up, submit jobs, and we'll run them. Because right now, we have the capacity to run all the jobs that get submitted. The machine's currently running at about an average load of about 25%. So if you get so keen that you push that up to beyond 100%, we may have to then think about more controlled ways of arbitrating access. Anyway, so the first of the first generation machines is Spinnaker 1. This has been designed from the silicon up. The Spinnaker chip took 5 years and 40 man-years of development work. And I always like to claim one of the strong points of chip design is you get more PhDs to the square millimeter than in most subjects, which clearly matters. Anyway, we designed this, and in fact, there are two chips inside the Spinnaker package, the Spinnaker processing layer, the compute layer, and an industry standard memory device. Those go in these attractive 2 centimeter square packages, and we can effectively tile a 2D surface of almost arbitrary size with these packages. The 2D surface we use is a standard size printed circuit board, which takes 48 chips, 864 processors, and that will allow you to model something roughly the scale of a small insect brain in biological real time. But we can then connect those boards together and build larger machines. And we've been running an open service on a 500,000 core machine since the end of March 2016, and just over a year ago, we upgraded this to the original target of 1 million cores. And so we now have a machine that's capable of running using fairly simplified point neuron models, something of the scale of a complete mouse brain. And there is in the HBP a mouse brain model, and we're looking at this. It's quite a tough challenge, but that's roughly the limit of what you can do on this machine. It's not the only machine in existence. We've been loaning Spinnaker boards and then selling them when we ran out of money to places all around the world. There are about 100 boards out in the locations shown on this map. And the smallest board, which has 4 chips on, is useful for mobile robotics and similar things. The big board gets you up to insect scale, and then the biggest machine is the 1 million core machine in Manchester, which, as I said, will get you to mouse scale. And the kind of application domains where this machine is strong, well, we built it to support computational neuroscience. That was the original goal. Within the HBP, we found some very interesting collaborations in the areas of theoretical neuroscience with people such as TU Graz and University of Bern. And we can use Spinnaker to test hypotheses of brain function on realistic brain models. And because Spinnaker has been built as a real-time system, it's very useful in neurorobotics, and we have a number of collaborations in that space. As an example of the target application, we worked on a model of the cortical microcircuit, which was originally developed at Jülich. And this was quite a challenging biological circuit for Spinnaker. This took quite a long time to get going. The paper at the bottom was published early last year, comparing the performance of this circuit on Spinnaker with its performance on the Jülich supercomputer systems. And we've used this as a benchmark, and since that paper was published, we now have a new paper out which is showing roughly approaching 2 orders of magnitude improvement in the performance and efficiency of this model through tuning our software. So this has been a very useful driver for improving the capacity of the Spinnaker system and the efficiency of the software subsystems. So that's Spinnaker in the current version. Brain Scales 1, as I say, is in a room near here, and the principle of Brain Scales is to model the neuronal behaviors at a much lower level. If you look at the way ions conduct through ion channels in neurons, you get equations which look very like the RC circuit shown on the right-hand side here, which of course is very familiar, much loved by electrical engineers, and we know how to make lots of those on a chip. So we build circuits that operate in very analogous ways to the physics that's going on in the biological system. If you look at the parameters that determine the time constants of these circuits, what you find is it's very difficult to make electronics as slow as biology. The carriers in electronics, electrons, are much lighter and faster than ions, and therefore it's natural to optimize for an accelerated neuron model. And the brain scale systems typically run at about 10 to the 4 faster than biology, so they're much faster than real time. And there are advantages and disadvantages to this. One of the advantages, of course, is if you want to model 5 years of childhood learning on a real-time system, it'll take you 5 years, and on brain scales, it'll take you 5 hours. So there's an obvious advantage there if you pull that together. If you want to couple it to a robot, then the fact it's running 10 to the 4 times faster is a bit trickier. So anyway, these circuits generate outputs which look very like biological neurons in terms of their behavior. And in order to achieve a significant scale of neural network, because unlike in Spinnaker, where basically the software multiplexes through the hardware so that a single piece of hardware models many neurons, if you do this physical modeling, you basically need a physical circuit for each neuron and each synapse that you're trying to model. And so to achieve scale, Heidelberg has developed mechanisms for delivering wafer scale systems where all of the chips, if you like, on the wafer, which are usually broken up and sold in individual packages, as we do with Spinnaker. In the Brainscale's case, they're all kept together and they're wired together on the wafer, so you can get a significant scale of system. And what's come out of this are things from individual chips for prototyping work, through to wafer modules, through to the full hybrid system, running accelerated. The models use adaptive exponential integrating fire neurons, which are neurons that have a very wide range of behavior, and in fact they can replicate all the behaviors observed in cortical neurons in terms of bursting and chattering and that kind of stuff. And this accelerated rate, sophisticated communications is required to keep things working across the wafer. And the system on the right, I mean, physically, it's a very similar size to the million-core Spinnaker machine. They all sit in a row of 2-meter-high cabinets, looking very much like conventional data center hardware. And the system on the right there, I think, has 20 wafers supporting simulation. So those are the first-generation systems. Within the HBP, we've been working on second-generation systems because, of course, the first-generation systems are now quite old technology, and the world doesn't stand still. So with Spinnaker, we're exploiting more modern process technology to implement more processors on the chip. The Spinnaker 1 chip has 18 processor cores. Spinnaker 2 will have 152. And basically everything on the chip is scaled up by roughly a factor of 10, so we can get 10x the efficiency and 10x the functional density. And this has been developed over the previous years of HBP, and it's being worked down to layout, and we have prototype chips on the bench that are small-scale versions of this to de-risk all the key technologies, and they're now functioning in our labs. They're not yet offering a service. That comes down the road. And if we look at what's in there, this is the techie bit of the Spinnaker talk. It's based around individual processing elements that can be used to compute neuron and or synapse models. And the kind of tricks we're pulling on Spinnaker 2 to make this more efficient are using techniques such as dynamic power management, so that each of the 152 processors can choose its performance and voltage level, and you can basically adjust efficiency against workload dynamically at the resolution of an individual time step, even down to 0.1 millisecond time steps. So we have very fine-grained power management on this chip. We've learned from Spinnaker 1 that we need better memory sharing, so you get that on Spinnaker 2. We've put on an accelerator for conventional machine learning because there's a sense that there's a synergy emerging between neuromorphics and mainstream industrial AI, and we're not quite sure where that's going, but we're building Spinnaker 2 as a hybrid system that can support straight conventional AI as well as spiking networks. But we are putting on accelerators for the biological systems as well, and what you need for modeling biology are very good sources of random numbers, and a few accelerators for exponentials and the like, connected together with a NOC, and then the really techie bit at the bottom to control the process variability in manufacture. In manufacture, we use adaptive body biasing, which reduces the variability and keeps the chips closer to the design targets. The kinds of things that have been shown on prototype chips already are quite interesting. An algorithm from Wolfgang Mass's group at Graz is deep rewiring, and this uses synaptic sampling as a mechanism. And here it's running a conventional artificial neural network. What it's showing is you can get state-of-the-art performance with a network where 99 out of 100 connections have been dropped. Okay, so you need fewer than 1% of connections to get full performance. And this kind of thing, I think, is going to have a big impact on machine learning, because machine learning at the moment runs on hardware that exploits the dense matrices in the machine learning. Biology, we know, is never dense. It's always sparse. And what we're showing here is even for machine learning, dense is probably the wrong answer, which means that NVIDIA GPUs will have to be grossly redesigned in the near future. And Spinnaker 2 will emerge in a large-scale system. This will happen outside the HVP. TU Dresden, who are our collaborators in this design work, have received generous funding from the Saxony Science Ministry to build a large-scale Spinnaker 2 system, and this will be used to generate all sorts of exciting large-scale models over the coming years. The second-generation brain-scale system is also, of course, building in knowledge from the first-generation system. That's why you build systems in generations. You learn from each generation and improve the next time. And BrainScales 2 has as its key idea the integration into the silicon of hardware-in-the-loop training. On the first-generation system, if you look at this big rack here, there's a very big computer in the middle of it that does lots of the work for loading things in and controlling them, but it's also where a lot of the learning happens if the networks have to be tuned to a particular application. And in BrainScales 1, this tuning, which is run on conventional computing, is done outside the wafers, and on BrainScales 2, that's going to be brought into the wafers. Turing-based computing, that's conventional computing, is used in lots of areas in this BrainScale system, despite the fact that the core model is on a non-Turing analog wafer scale system. So in BrainScales 2, a slightly different view of the structure of the system is being taken, and the analog circuits that model the spiking neurons are being viewed as co-processors to a conventional computer, which is now embedded in the chip, if you like, or in multiple points on the wafer. And this is implementing the hardware-in-the-loop learning directly down in the wafer, so that you have learning very close to the networks that you have to tune and get to learn from that. So in learning and plasticity, we're using a biologically relevant neural model. This is the adaptive exponential model, as on BrainScales 1, using relevant network topologies. So this system will support 10K synapses per neuron and more than that, which is a limitation of quite a lot of neuromorphic systems. They can't get close to biological synaptic connectivity. You need lots of bandwidth for scalability, particularly if you're running at 10 to the 4 times real time, then the communication bandwidth requirements are quite strong. And one of the fundamental problems with analog systems is you have millions of parameters on this wafer that you need to get right, and you need to adjust and tune. And a trivial solution is you work out everything ahead of time on the host computer and then load things in. to get them run as intended. But a better approach is to exploit this hardware in the loop training and get the systems to tune themselves as they're in operation. And so some kind of learning or plasticity mechanism is built in at the lowest level. Feedback loops adjust system parameters. The learning replaces calibration. On a fixed analog system, there's a lot of calibration required to tune the system correctly, and learning replaces that in these kinds of applications. And the network topology itself will adjust to improve performance. And so with BrainScales 2, you've got this hardware in the loop training. You can look at the spikes that are coming out of the various neurons in the system. These can then be analyzed by the processor on the system, weights adjusted, and the system tuned to give the performance that you're looking for. And if that's whets your appetite for learning more about neuromorphics, then come back here next March. Heidelberg is host to the world's major annual meeting on neuromorphics, which is the NICE workshop, which every year so far has been held in North America. That next year, for the first time, it's leaving North America and coming to Europe, and appropriately, it's coming to Heidelberg. That's Heidelberg, I think, when the weather's a bit nicer than today, which I guess it might be in March, and it might not. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Inspiring talk and perfect timing as well. So I think we can allow one question if there's someone who urgently wants to ask one, but if not, we can proceed to the next speaker. So this is going to be interesting because we have Lars Klue from Danish Board of Technology Foundation, who is going to talk about societal relation, neuroethics, and inclusive community building. And unfortunately, Lars became sick yesterday, and we will have him by video conference.
Can you hear me?
So do we have a connection, Björn?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Just a moment. Just a moment. Do not start yet. I still have to get the sound to the video conference.
No, there's a feedback.
Lars, you can start.
I can start now. Thank you. And sorry to everyone that I'm not with you. I would have liked to, but as you can hear from my voice, it's probably good that I didn't. I will talk about another end of the Human Brain Project and also in the future of EBRAINS, which are about the societal relation, neuroethics, and the inclusive community building. It's embedded now in Human Brain Project as what is called the Ethics and Society sub-project, and it will continue as in the next phase of the Human Brain Project. And with regards to the community, certainly after the end of the Human Brain Project. But I will come back to aspects of this later. So this is a little overview of some of my main messages. So if you get them from this presentation, then I'm happy. One thing I would like to make you grab is that such a big project with the content it has is important to create relevant science or societal benefits and license to operate, and social relations are extremely important for that. Also, I will tell you about neuroethics, which is a concept which is beginning to be defined out of the traditional bioethics. And it's getting more and more obvious that for having an infrastructure which should be open for collaboration across the whole of the globe, we need to have a certain minimum standard of neuroethics that we can agree upon. And finally, I will talk about inclusive community building for an EBRAINS community. And this community is to gather all interested and make them work together so that EBRAINS can be used for science and innovation that creates benefits to the whole of society. So if you grab these points after my presentation, then I'm happy. Let's start with the societal relations. Often when you talk about public relations, you are thinking of communication outwards. That's what you could call outreach. But I would like to make you think a little of that. Human Brain Project has a lot of outreach. It's very important. It's important to talk about what Human Brain is, to make people understand it, to communicate what you're doing. But with the societal relations, we're actually talking about in-reach, listening. So beginning to meet people where they are, listen to their needs and concerns, and then act upon them. This is the basic principle of responsible research and innovation, that you try to anticipate what can happen in the future, you reflect on it, you engage people and discuss with them, and then you act upon what you hear. And that's the way to change science into something that has higher relevance, has a smaller risk of running into conflicts. So, and with neuroscience, I think it's important to understand that there are controversial aspects of neuroscience, and so we need to take this approach. What are the responses? Yes, as I said, avoiding conflicts and thereby having license to operate. So that's the results for science. For society, the hope is that there would be more relevant and science out of it, more innovation that creates benefits, and also that the dialogue we creates a real reason for trust in society to the scientists working with this. We have had two important aspects of this kind of relations, which are the stakeholder forums and the citizen consultations. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. We have, for the moment, been working with three concepts: privacy, dual use, and artificial intelligence. The privacy theme was the first we took up in the HBP, and the reason was that privacy at that time was not really something science cared so much about. And there was no clear privacy policy in the Human Brain Project when it started. So this was taken up, and a program was set up in order to create a good privacy policy. It included webinars, meetings, internal meetings in the Human Brain Project, stakeholder workshop, and we made a citizen survey around it. This resulted in a Human Brain Project privacy policy, which I'm not afraid of saying is state-of-the-art for big data research projects. It means we have a data protection officer, we have a data management working group, and all these work together with ethics reporting people who can point at when they see any problems. We have an ethics advisory board who can also take a stand on issues that come up. So you could say the whole privacy problem and other ethics problems are packed into a system that comes from this original activity to make sure that potential issues are being taken up and done something with. The second theme we took up was dual use of brain research, and we focused in this on what you could call dual use of concern. So that's use in the in politics, in security, in intelligence work and military work of research. Sorry. We reacted on some people we have talked with, including the military, certainly said that they are very interested in brain research. There were several reports out there saying that brain research was, in some aspects of military technology development, one of the things they really focused on. So what we did was we put up stakeholder interviews, webinars, and workshops. We made citizen meetings in 9 European countries where they asked about what they thought of the things we had thought. And this resulted in a dual-use working group, which is working with a dual-use action plan that has been developed. The idea here is to scan what goes on in the Human Brain Project and look at if there are dual-use aspects of concern in them. If there are, then take a discussion about what can be done with them. Is it something that can just continue, or should there be put something into place? Is it something that should be taken up at a higher level? How to deal with it? At the moment, we have a consultation in 13 countries ongoing on artificial intelligence, especially focusing on aspects of artificial intelligence of relevance to the Human Brain Project and EBRAINS, but also aspects of what you could call soft or harder regulation of artificial intelligence in the future. Where can we use it, under which conditions? What are the standard operating procedures that should surround AI so that it's trustworthy, it doesn't have bias, and so on. These 13 countries are making consultations with citizens now, and it's done in a way so that citizens can meet at the kitchen table. They can log up to the system we have and register a meeting, a local meeting, and then they can invite friends or neighbors to discuss with them up against an online system we have. So this is the first time that we use this distributed way of engaging citizens. Neuroethics. Next slide, please. Neuroethics is an emerging concept. We could roughly say that it's about how neuroscience and the use of its results can live up to our societal values, but of course it also have quite philosophical aspects to it. How do we deal with understanding more about the brain? What will it mean for the way we understand people? What it will mean for the way we treat people? So of course there are many aspects in neuroscience, and that's exactly why neuroethics are being developed now. We are looking into what are the specific things that come up in neuroethics compared to the bioethics we already know. But we're also looking at how global neuroscience can collaborate under a certain common standards of ethics. I will say a little more about this later. And in the longer term, we're also looking into what it will actually mean for society if we begin to understand the brain deeper than what we do now. We have seen other big developments in biology that had big impacts on society simply because of the way we began to think of things. What will it mean when we begin to think of human differently, maybe, because we begin to understand how the brain works. So we're also taking these neuroethical considerations up in the very longer term. HBP has already implemented ethics management. We have a data protection officer, GDI compliance checks, ethics rapporteurs, dual-use working group, as I told about, ethics advisory board, etc. The next 3 years, one of the things we will work on is to try to see if it's possible to establish a common global understanding about minimum standards for neuroethics. Next slide, please. This will be done through theoretical analysis, but it will end up with a global citizen engagement activity, presumably in 2022. What we will do there is we will, as we are doing now in the AI consultation, create small distributed meetings around the world in people's local languages up against a computer that shows them the information they need, give them the questions they can discuss, and then ask them to have their opinion put into the computer. Meetings can be made by citizens. They log up, create a meeting, get a link, and they send this link to some friends that they want to invite. And then these people can put in their information through a smartphone, pad, or PC. So this is facilitated online. Everybody will get the same information, same meeting process everywhere, same questions to all, and they can answer through the device they have. Issues that probably will be taken up is are questions about brain data privacy across the globe, different consent systems across the globe. What about global data sharing if data are not all of them collected in ways that we ethically can accept? What about different lab animal practices across the globe? So we will over the next year begin to develop all these questions that we want to ask the citizens of, to see how we look at these things across the globe, because there will probably be cultural and historical factors that influence how people answer, and we have to have them into our mind when we try to develop some sort of global standard for ethics, for neuroethics. Next slide, please. The last thing I will talk about is the community building efforts we're doing. We're establishing an EBRAINS community that will be an open community that embraces all actors willing to contribute in one way or another to the development and use of EBRAINS. The Human Brain Project is somewhat of a closed club, you can say. It's an EU project, and with EU projects, I mean, most often, those that can work in it are people who are partners in the project. So as far as an EU project is a closed club, HBP is a closed club. It is totally different with the EBRAINS community and with EBRAINS in the future. It's very important to understand that the EBRAINS infrastructure and the EBRAINS community will be totally open for other users. So there's a big difference between, you could say, the organizational and technological access in Human Brain Project and in EBRAINS. We are imagining 3 types of users in EBRAINS, but this can change over time because we are making the strategies of community building now. But what we are thinking of right now is that we will have 3 groups: support users, EBRAINS users, and collaborators. The support user can be expert users like in the high-level support team that we have now. It can be super users that know some tools quite well, maybe are situated out in different universities. It can be supporters, maybe that each university has some people in their in-house who knows a little more about EBRAINS and how it works than others normally do, and so can help them to get access and all that. So we imagine that there will be a group of different supporters on different levels as one type of users. The other users are EBRAINS users. So that's the scientists, industry, employees, clinicians, etc., who are able to use the infrastructure. So they are not supporters, but they are able to use the tools for their research and innovation. And the final group, which is important to for this community, we think are what we can call the collaborators. These are also scientists. They are from industry. They can be from civil society organizations, patient organizations. They can also be funders. And we invite them into the EBRAINS community so that they can take part in defining, funding, and doing research, even though if they are not able technically to use the infrastructure. So the whole idea of these collaborators is that they have knowledge, important knowledge, that can be used in the in projects. So it's important that they take part in development projects and activities of the infrastructure. So the idea here is that excellent science of benefit to society will happen when these 3 types of users pool their competences and work together. This is my last slide. Just give an overview of the idea of the community. We have these 3. We have 3 different types of sub-communities in the EBRAINS community that we call national sub-communities, thematic sub-communities, and innovation sub-communities. The national speaks for itself. We could here in Denmark, where I come from, create an EBRAINS Denmark, where the universities, industries, and whoever who wants to take part can meet, speak in Danish, have Danish students on board, make our own education programs, develop a curriculum for Danish universities on EBRAINS, and etc. Then we have the thematic sub-communities. They could, for example, be thematic around some of the service categories that are being provided by the infrastructure. They could be thematic about a certain discipline or sub-discipline in neuroscience. So these are bottom-up constructed sub-communities, probably across nations, across borders, but people who would like to focus on specific topics that they would like to use EBRAINS for. And finally, we have the innovation sub-communities, which could be thought of as being close to being projects. So these are, for example, industry, researchers, funders, patient organizations, whoever, who go together in order to solve a specific innovation project together. And then we have the three types of users. The activities are the stars, and these are only a selection of what you can imagine. We will develop an inspiration catalog for the different communities so that they can make all different kinds of activities in the community in the future. Many of the things you know about, you know what a hackathon is, you know what education is, a summit, you know what a curriculum is, and so on. I would like you to look down in the left lower corner where open research agenda setting is mentioned. This is a specific kind of activity that the EU forwards right now, which is good, because it's about inviting societal actors and multidisciplinary groups into dialogues in order to develop research agendas together. The idea in the EBRAINS community is to invite the support users, EBRAINS users, and collaborators to discuss what they think, which kind of research do they think should happen with the use of the EBRAINS infrastructure. And hopefully they can do that and establish funding and begin to develop the common projects that we see to the left. So the idea here is, if we can bring all these people together and we can begin to make them talk about what is it actually that should be going on this infrastructure, then they could develop new tools for the infrastructure, or they could make projects that makes use of the infrastructure together. And if we can reach that, then we have reached the goals with the EBRAINS community, because that will give relevant research, but it will also ensure that the EBRAINS community gives clear benefits to its users, and that's basically the whole idea of the thing, isn't it? So this was my last words. Thanks for listening.
The remaining speakers to come in the front, and we put some chairs for you. And Lars will be still with us on the internet. You're only free, yes. Okay, so as you know, we also had questions on the internet, which I was collecting. And I will start with that one, and then we ask the audience to also propose questions. So the question from the internet, on the website it says EBRAINS is coming soon. So how soon?
Yeah, it will be introduced gradually. So we do consider the present version as a pre-launch version. So we would like to have more content before we consider EBRAINS to be properly fully launched. Examples in this regard of services that are suitable to go into the EBRAINS system is definitely the neurorobotics platform, which is very well prepared for this. It will soon be embedded. There are definitely aspects of the neuromorphic computing services that can be presented through EBRAINS, and we have discussed exactly how that can be done. Remember the definition of EBRAINS. The definition is that it's clearly presented for the outside community how they can approach EBRAINS and what they can do. And this we will manage for the Neuromorphic very soon. And so we go through the whole system. So the reason for this message is simply that we would like to have a few more than these teasers that are there at this point in time. So I would say give it a couple of months, and you will get a message if you sign up to the email, and you will see a more comprehensive list of contents. And it will continue to be populated during 2020.
Thank you, Jan. Just a comment also from YouTube stream. Well done, and definitely keep it up. So that's a very good message. And I would like to ask if there are questions from the audience. Who would like to?
Possible small addition, of course, is that the HBP website has a lot to offer. So this is transition from one to the other is what we're talking about, and improving the way it is presented to the outside so that it is entirely clear how you can use it. That is the key aspect. But please go to the HBP website, those of you who are interested in seeing what there is from the HBP.
So I would like to read another one from the internet. What are the most important results the HBP has so far?
Would Neuromorphic like to begin?
Yeah, I can only really speak from the Neuromorphic side. We have two of the world's largest neuromorphic computing platforms available as services. I don't think anybody's really tried to operate neuromorphics as a service before HBP, so I think we're the first out there with that, and we have a significant number of users, but we could cope with more than we currently have. And we are beginning to see some models that are using the neuromorphic platform that are breaking new ground in terms of their ability to model the complexity of biological systems and the testing of new theories about both brain function and kind of where brain function meets machine learning, I think are the important areas.
If I were to continue on the science side, there is, of course, a lot of science in the Human Brain Project. Excellent scientists producing publications as there are in other projects. However, in the context of this meeting, we should perhaps focus on what is related to these platforms and the research infrastructure. I'd like to follow up by mentioning one example on the atlasing ecosystem that we are building. This is to a high degree visible as it is today. And I do not think there is anywhere else you can find these collections of tools and services related to atlases. This is one achievement that will be highlighted considerably also with more practical pipelines for use of these atlases in EBRAINS very soon. That's another example. And of course, as Steve says, he gives an example from Neuromorphic. If we would have neurorobotics people here now, they can give their examples and so on. This goes for all the different platforms of HBP. Would you like to comment as well?
Well, I mean, I think there are a few things to mention in this context. I mean, first of all, is I think what HBP has achieved is to ramp up, say, the use also of cerebral simulations for brain research. It took certainly much longer than it was, say, anticipated at the very beginning. There was a much stronger focus on this, but I think we see now here, say, a growing number of users. And another aspect which is really more looking, say, beyond HBP, if it comes to, say, federating infrastructures, this is now attracting, say, a lot of interest, and Phoenix is now getting a kind of a template also, for instance, of activities of the European Commission in the context of EuroHPC. So to see, say, the value of having, say, communities which are, say, willing, I mean, to collaborate on efforts with all different kinds of methods, and having, say, at the same time, say, the evolution of infrastructures which facilitate that.
Thank you very much. So I have actually another question from someone who is actually present here but a little bit shy to speak and prefers to write it on the internet. What about the Bundestag exhibition? I have seen a flyer. So if any of you would like to comment a little bit on this, maybe elaborate.
I think that exhibition is taking place now. Wouldn't that be the case? Opens on Wednesday. Okay. So I guess we are just basically waiting for rumors about the Bundestag exhibition, and we haven't. There is no news yet.
So I guess you just have to attend if
you have to attend, doesn't it?
If you can, yes.
If you may, yes.
That is great. Okay, well, I actually have one more here on the internet. What is unique about the HPP infrastructure compared to other projects?
That's an easy one. Maybe first, what is not unique to get to the point. There are, of course, a number of aspects related to platforms and research infrastructure that are precisely the same, regardless of what field you're in some sense. And of course, on the HPC side, on the computing side, you can deliver to many communities. So I think what is the key point there is that although that is the case, if you're going to get something useful out of a service for neuroscience, it has to be adopted to neuroscience. If we take the example of sharing data, just as one example, there are of course services today that allows you to share data, but there are no services that provides you with metadata schemas that are adopted to neuroscience. You have to have that. If you just have a service that deals with some kind of standardized metadata that doesn't really speak to the brain, it's not going to help you much in terms of making data findable, accessible, interpretable, interoperable, and reusable. So that's one example. Also, for example, when you deal with the brain, just like in geography, as we talked about before today, there are certain characteristics of the brain which you don't find in all the disciplines. And that is the fact that location is so important. The brain is not, so a system, an infrastructure built for the liver would not work very well. Presumably what happens in any corner of the liver is roughly the same, which is indeed not the case in the brain. So that's why you have to deal with location, and you have to deal with location at the highest possible level of precision. Not meaning you can't do neuroscience without that, but if you can do that, you gain a lot more. And that's why you need specialized infrastructures going in such directions, and you can continue like that. Basically what you do is, of course, to use all the generic technologies, but you need to have the specific solutions for the field. That's my perspective, and I'm sure there are other ways of looking at this as well.
I can add one aspect. I mean, of course, if you look at the individual pieces, like, for instance, adding metadata to data, I mean, that has been addressed in other fields. But I think the particular challenge in neuroscience is that you have these, say, big diversity of the data, and to really get to a point. I'm not sure whether we fully got to this point, but HPP is very close to that point of being able to integrate data from all different kinds of sources. I think that would be, say, a major achievement. And there you go beyond from what is done in the weather community, what is done in different other, say, simulation science communities, where, say, the simulation is the source of the data, or if you look at all kinds of experimental facilities, physics experiments, where, of course, you have, say, a long of this tradition, but there is a much bigger uniformity of basically the source of the data. And I think this is a very big challenge, and HPP is now finding a good path to solve that.
Yeah, and I think maybe another way of saying it is to challenge everyone. The neuroscience field will have to solve it. Because if neuroscience really wants to contribute to understanding the brain, there is a need to think carefully through how we do our things. And we can continue working in very separate smaller groups and doing things in a very individualized way. And there's a lot of good coming out of that. The question is only, what can you do on top of that that could help us move faster? And this is, for example, in the direction of what the Exploiter is saying. So in the current situation, we take what we get into our knowledge graph in terms of, or into the HPP storage. But our curators, they organize and manage the data so that they are easy to follow and to find and to interpret. The next step is, of course, to see now how can we take the next step in terms of standardizing data formats. And there are efforts in that regard, particularly, or one example only is the imaging field, where there are standards evolving. And of course, here we contribute, not alone, but with others. And the same for the metadata schemas themselves. And actually, in that context, it's important to say that HPP interacts directly with the other international initiatives around the world, because there's no point in really having separate standards for one part of the field. You want to go as broad as you can. So we try to do that, and I wouldn't say we can take, let's say, are responsible for dealing with it entirely, but we definitely are on that page and contribute to going in that direction. And that's very important for neuroscience as a whole.
Can I add one thing? I think that compared to the other neuroscience programs, HPP is developing something that has a potential for just continuing.
Excuse me. Wait, Lars, please, Lars. I first have to switch you.
Oh.
Okay, now you should be able to talk.
Now I'm able to talk. I'll just say that compared to the other brain programs, I think the EBRAINS infrastructure, and if you also in that include the idea of the EBRAINS community, has a potential for growing and just taking up and including more and more tools. So basically, I think it's worth thinking of that infrastructure very much like you could think of the space infrastructures or the CERN or other very large infrastructures. EBRAINS has a potential for growing and delivering the services as people want to put them into the infrastructure. I think that's this backbone function of the EBRAINS is very important.
Thank you very much, Lars. And I have one final question, actually, also from the internet. Do you accept new partners to the project?
We can answer that one easily. I think I mentioned in my presentation there are 9 open calls or 9 calls out there at this point in time. Proposal deadline is December 2 to 11. And that is exactly about the new partners. So yes, there is dynamics involved in the project itself. And then second comes the partnering projects, which are not funded by the HPP mechanism directly. And of course, the fact that the EBRAINS, the concept of EBRAINS, is to present tools and services that can be used by others, and also gradually to absorb and allow other infrastructure providers to use EBRAINS as a useful umbrella as we go forwards, also into a situation where the HPP will most likely not exist anymore. And that's why, actually, the formation of EBRAINS has 2 sides to it. One is the EBRAINS portal that we have focused on today. The other is the EBRAINS legal entity, which actually has a board of directors meeting today in Brussels, and which is the foundation for the continuation of the infrastructure in the future, which again is very relevant to the question of the partners, because this may partly be the same as before, but also with indeed new partners and participation from perhaps players that we have not interacted with so much so far.
Thank you very much. So if there are no questions from the audience, I would like to thank you all, and first of all, thank the speakers for giving excellent talks and answering the questions, and thank you all for attending today's event. We'll definitely keep in touch. Please follow HPP, and also please follow EBRAINS. There will be more and exciting stuff in the future. Thank you very much.